Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sleeping Historian, your cozy corner for drifting off through the calm stories of history. Tonight, we're journeying back in time to the flickering candlelight and echoing halls of medieval Europe, exploring the fascinating world of universities, students, and scholars who shaped the course of learning. Before we dive into this soothing adventure, if you enjoy relaxing history stories and want to join our quiet, curious community, please subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the past. Now, snuggle in, relax, and let us wander together through the stone corridors, candlelit rooms, and bustling streets of Europe's first great universities. By candlelight, entering the world of medieval learning, imagine this. It's late at night, the air is cool, and the only light around you comes from candles. Their flames flicker, throwing shadows against stone walls. You hear the low crackle of wax dripping, and the quiet scratch of a quill across parchment. A group of young men, wrapped in cloaks against the chill, bend their heads over their studies. Their faces glow in a soft light, half tired, half determined. Welcome, my friend. You've just stepped into the world of the medieval university. Now, don't think of university the way we imagine it today, with shiny lecture halls, Wi-Fi, and overpriced coffee. No, this is the 11th and 12th centuries. Europe is just starting to wake up after what people like to call the Dark Ages. And here, in the middle of dusty towns and noisy marketplaces, something completely new is being born. A place where learning itself becomes the main business. The mood of the time life back then was not exactly easy. Most people were farmers, waking up with the sun and going to bed with it. Books were rare. Most folks never saw one in their lifetime. Reading and writing were almost like magic tricks, skills held mostly by monks, priests, or scribes. But slowly, cities started to grow. Trade routes opened up, more coins jingled in pockets, and cathedrals rose higher and higher. Alongside all this, people wanted knowledge. They wanted to understand God, the law, medicine, and the stars. And so, cathedral schools and monastic schools became crowded. Priests and teachers couldn't keep up with demand. Out of this pressure, the university was born. What is a university, anyway? Here's the funny thing. When people in the Middle Ages said university, they didn't mean a campus with stone towers and ivy walls. Nope, the Latin word universitas simply meant a guild, or a group, like a union. Just like cobblers or bakers had guilds, scholars and students formed their own. They banded together to protect themselves, set rules, and make sure nobody cheated them. A university was really just a club for people who were crazy enough to spend their lives chasing knowledge. At first, these groups gathered around big churches, cathedrals, or monuments. Picture the great Notre Dame in Paris, or the leaning towers of Bologna. Around these holy and busy places, students arrived by the hundreds, then by the thousands. They rented rooms, found teachers, and slowly built a life that was both tough and exciting. The candlelit hall. Let's walk inside one of these early lecture halls. It's not glamorous. No glass windows, no soft seats, and definitely no PowerPoint slides. Just a cold stone room with wooden benches. The master, the teacher, sits at a high chair, almost like a throne, with a big book laid open in front of him. Remember, books were precious. They weren't printed yet. Every single page had to be copied by hand. So a single book could cost more than a horse. The teacher reads slowly, in Latin, while the students listen, shiver, and scribble what they can. Sometimes they argue, sometimes they snore. Sometimes a candle sputters out, and everyone groans because now they can barely see. But this was learning in its raw form. A little humor in the hardships. Students back then weren't so different from students today. They complained about food, money, and boring lectures. They wore second-hand clothes, sometimes even borrowing cloaks to look halfway respectable. Imagine walking into a hall, hoping the master doesn't notice you've been wearing the same tunic for weeks. And exams? Well, let us just say failing an oral exam in front of your classmates was just as embarrassing back then as failing a test is now. The difference is, you didn't just lose marks. Sometimes you lost months or even years of progress. Yikes. And yet, they came. From villages far away, from noble courts, even from other countries. Why? Because a university degree wasn't just about knowledge, it was about opportunity. With it, you could rise in the church, become a lawyer, or even a physician. Without it, you stayed stuck. Why universities mattered. Here's something worth remembering. These universities didn't appear out of nowhere. They were part of a bigger story. Europe was changing. Trade, towns, and kings all needed literate people to keep track of money, laws, and contracts. The church needed trained theologians to argue about fine points of doctrine. And perhaps most importantly, people had questions. Big questions. What is the nature of God? How do we understand the world? Can reason and faith work together? Universities gave people the space to wrestle with these questions. They weren't perfect, and they were often chaotic, but they were the closest thing the medieval world had to centers of free thought. Our story's journey in this series, we're going to follow that candlelight through stone corridors. We'll walk beside a young student as he arrives in Paris, Bologna, or Oxford. We'll listen to the creak of benches as he sits in class. We'll join him in the tavern when he sneaks out after curfew. We'll laugh at his misadventures and feel his stress as exams loom. We'll also look closely at the universities themselves. Paris, with its towering cathedral and its famous theologians. Bologna, with its lawyers and endless legal scrolls. Oxford, younger, but loud, proud, and full of trouble. Each place had its own personality, its own reputation, a gentle invitation, so, settle back. Imagine the world long before screens and smartphones, when all learning came from memory, debate, and handwritten books. Imagine the smell of ink, the whisper of Latin phrases, and the long patience of students who believed knowledge was worth every hardship. And as you drift with this story, think of how close we still are to them. When we sit in lecture halls, when we wear gowns at graduation, when we grumble about homework, we're echoing lives lived centuries ago. This is the beginning of our journey. A journey by candlelight, through cold stone halls, alongside generations of students who carried the flame of learning through the long night of history. From monasteries to schools, the seeds of learning before there were universities filled with noisy students and endless lectures. There were monasteries, quiet, peaceful places, far from towns, where monks in long robes lived, prayed, and worked. If you walked into one of these monasteries around the year 900, you wouldn't find taverns or heated arguments about Aristotle. Instead, you'd hear chanting in the chapel, the ringing of bells marking each hour, and the soft sound of quills scratching parchment in the scriptorium, the writing room. This is where the story of medieval universities truly begins. The quiet world of the monastery monks weren't exactly chasing careers in law or medicine. Their main focus was on God. They prayed, farmed the land, baked bread, brewed ale, and, most importantly for us, copied books. Remember, there were no printing presses. Every single book had to be copied by hand. Imagine sitting at a wooden desk, a candle burning low, your hand aching as you copy line after line of Latin. One slip of ink, and you might have to scrape the parchment and start over. That's patience on a level most of us can barely imagine. Books were rare treasures, kept locked in cupboards or chained to desks. And yet, without these patient monks, most of ancient learning would have been lost. They copied the Bible, of course, but also old works of Roman law, Greek philosophy, and even medical texts. Cathedral schools appear. As Europe became a little more settled after centuries of invasions, people wanted more education beyond the cloister. Bishops in large cities started schools near their cathedrals. These were called very simply cathedral schools. Think of Paris, with its mighty cathedral of Notre Dame rising above the Seine. Around it, priests taught young boys not just how to chant psalms, but also how to read, write, and reason. Slowly, lessons grew beyond the Bible to include logic, grammar, and even bits of science. If monasteries were the quiet greenhouses of knowledge, cathedral schools were the gardens in the middle of busy towns. They attracted not only boys training to become priests, but also sons of nobles who needed education for government service, and even ambitious commoners who hoped learning might open doors. The subjects of early study? Now, picture a wide range of electives like Tadeno, history of rock music, or introduction to computer science. The curriculum was simple, but powerful. It was called the 7 liberal arts, divided into 2 groups. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Basically, how to speak well, argue better, and win debates at dinner tables. The quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Numbers, shapes, harmony, and the movement of the heavens. If you mastered these, you were considered an educated person. Later, if you wanted to go further, you could dive into theology, medicine, or law. But the 7 liberal arts were the foundation. Why people wanted schools in the early Middle Ages? Most people couldn't read or write. You didn't need it to plow fields or shear sheep. But kings and bishops, merchants and lawyers, they needed educated people. Someone had to write down charters, record contracts, and keep track of who owed taxes. The church, too, needed sharp minds. Debates about faith were constant, and the church wanted trained theologians to defend its teachings. After all, ideas can be just as dangerous as swords. So, schools grew. Monks still copied texts, but more and more young men gathered in towns to learn from masters. From teacher to master at first. A school might just mean one respected teacher gathering students in a church porch or a small hall. But the best teachers gained reputations. Students would travel miles, even countries, just to learn from a certain master. One famous example is Peter Abelard in Paris. Brilliant, fiery, and often controversial, Abelard attracted huge crowds of students in the 12th century. His debates about theology were so bold that he often clashed with church authorities. But his fame showed how much hunger there was for knowledge. The shift toward universities by the 11th and 12th centuries. Something new was happening. These schools weren't just small local groups anymore. They were starting to organize. Students and teachers formed guilds, just like craftsmen did. They wanted protection, fair rules, and recognition. That's when the idea of a universitas took root, a corporate body of scholars, officially recognized, with the right to grant degrees. It wasn't about pretty buildings yet. It was about the people. A university was simply the community of masters and students, bound together by rules, privileges, and the pursuit of knowledge. A glimpse of the growing cities. Let's pause for a moment and imagine the world outside these schools. Medieval towns were noisy, smelly, and alive with sound. Blacksmiths hammering, merchants shouting prices, pigs rooting in the mud. Into this chaos came students, young, often poor, sometimes noble, carrying parchment rolls under their arms and speaking Latin phrases that few townsfolk understood. To ordinary people, they seemed strange, half holy, half troublemaker. To kings and bishops, though they were useful, educated men meant better government, stronger courts, and sharper arguments in the endless church councils. Seeds ready to grow. So, when we talk about the first universities of Europe, Bologna, Oxford, we have to remember where they came from. They grew out of the quiet patience of monks, the organized teaching of cathedral schools, and the restless energy of young people hungry to learn. The candlelight of the monastery was carried into the bustling streets of cities. The silent copying of scripture turned into loud debates about philosophy, and slowly, step by step, the university was born. Closing reflection, it's a little funny to think about. If not for monks bent over parchment, maybe with a bit of ink on their noses, or priests patiently drilling Latin grammar into restless boys, we might not have universities at all. The seeds were planted in cloisters and cathedrals. Soon those seeds would grow into something much larger, much louder, and sometimes much rowdier. For in the next part of our story, students will begin to arrive from all over Europe. With their patched cloaks and hopeful hearts, they'll turn quiet schools into bustling centers of life and learning. But for now, imagine the stillness of a monastery library, a single candle burning, and a monk slowly turning the pages of a book he has spent years copying. That's where it all began, the humble, patient birth of the medieval university. The birth of the university. We've wandered through the monasteries, we've peeked into cathedral schools, and now, at last, we arrive at something new, the university. Not the kind with dorm parties and shiny sports teams, but the rough, candlelit, medieval kind. It didn't spring up in one night. It grew, slowly, like ivy climbing an old wall. Still, by the 12th century, something remarkable was taking shape across Europe. Groups of teachers and students coming together, setting rules, and forming what they proudly called a universitas. What did university mean? When we hear the word today, we picture buildings, libraries, lecture halls, grassy quads. Back then, universitas meant something very different. It didn't mean a campus. It didn't even mean a single school. It meant a guild, a collective, a legal body. Just like shoemakers had their guild, or stonemasons had theirs, scholars created their own. A university was not made of stone and mortar, it was made of people. Masters and students joined together, agreed on rules, and demanded recognition from both church and king. Why form a guild? Simple answer, survival. Students in the Middle Ages were often young, broke, and far from home. Masters needed protection from pushy bishops or greedy townsfolk who tried to control them. By forming a guild, they gained power. They could negotiate privileges, set their own discipline, and even hold their own courts. Imagine being a poor student in Bologna. The landlord tries to overcharge you for your freezing rat-filled room. Normally, you'd just suffer. But if you're part of the university guild, you can complain, and the guild can punish the landlord. Suddenly, you're not just one skinny scholar with an empty pursuer backed by hundreds of fellow students and teachers. Strength in numbers. Recognition by church and crown. Universities weren't official at first. They had to fight for recognition. And in the Middle Ages, only two powers really mattered, the church and the monarchy. The church granted charters to universities, protecting their independence. For example, Pope Innocent III recognized the University of Paris in the early 13th century. Kings too gave privileges exempting scholars from certain taxes, or promising them fair treatment under the law. Why? Because kings and popes realized how useful universities were. They produced priests, judges, clerks, and advisors, the very people who kept kingdoms and churches running smoothly. Supporting universities was like investing in your own bureaucracy. Paris, Bologna, Oxford, the big three different universities developed with different personalities. Bologna became famous for law. Students there were powerful, even hiring and firing their teachers. They studied Roman law so carefully that European legal systems were shaped by their work. Paris specialized in theology, with its mighty cathedral schools. It was the place to go if you wanted to dive deep into questions about God, faith, and philosophy. Oxford, in England, grew quickly in the 12th century. It was smaller and rougher, but it became famous for both scholarship and student riots. Each university had its own flavor, and ambitious students sometimes traveled between them, chasing knowledge and, sometimes just chasing adventure. Life inside the new universitas now. Let's picture a day in this newborn institution. The bell rings at dawn. Students shuffle into a cold hall, carrying scraps of parchment and dull quills. The master takes his seat at the high desk and begins reading from a precious book. His voice echoes in Latin, the universal language of learning. Students scribble, whisper, yawn, and occasionally argue. Debates break out, sometimes heated enough that fists fly. After class, students might rush to the tavern, or crowd into their guild halls to discuss rules and privileges. This wasn't just school. It was a whole community, messy and loud, but determined to keep knowledge alive. Tensions with the town. Where there are students, there is trouble. Townsfolk often hated the universities. Students could be noisy, arrogant, and a little too fond of ale. Worse, they had legal privileges that placed them outside the reach of local courts. If a student punched a shopkeeper, the case went to the bishop's court, not the town judge. You can imagine how much the locals loved that arrangement. But the universities held firm. They argued that scholars were special, serving a higher purpose. Their mission knowledge placed them above petty local squabbles. Whether towns agreed or not, popes and kings usually backed the scholars. Degrees. The medieval passport. Out of these new guilds came a new idea: degrees. At first, there were only a few. The bachelor's degree showed basic mastery. The master's degree allowed you to teach. The doctorate, usually in law, medicine, or theology, was the highest honor. Getting one wasn't easy. You didn't just write essays. You had to endure long oral examinations, sometimes lasting hours, defending your ideas in public. It was nerve-wracking, but it gave you status for life. A degree was like a passport. With it, you could travel to any university in Europe and doors would open. The buzz of a new world. Let's pause and feel the excitement. In the middle of muddy towns and dangerous roads, here was something rare: a network of minds, stretching across Europe. A student from Spain could study in Paris, then move to Bologna, then teach in Oxford. No matter where he went, Latin connected him to fellow scholars. The medieval university was, in its own way, the first real international community of learning. It was messy, sure. Students rioted, teachers argued, and landlords complained. But through it all, knowledge spread slowly, carefully, like ink soaking into parchment. A bit of humor? Of course. Let's not imagine medieval universities as golden temples of wisdom. They were still filled with human beings, with all their quirks. Students skipped lectures. Teachers sometimes recycled the same lessons year after year, and Latin. Not every student spoke it well. Some stuttered through grammar exercises, mangling the words so badly that their classmates howled with laughter. In other words, some things never change. Students then were just as human as students today. Closing reflection. So, here we are. From monasteries and cathedral schools, the first true universities have appeared. They are not beautiful, yet just drafty halls, noisy students, and tired masters. But they are alive. They are buzzing with thought. The medieval university is like a newborn child, fragile, loud, and sometimes troublesome. But it carries something precious inside it, the promise of generations of learning to come. And as we move forward in our story, we'll leave behind these early days of guilds and charters. Next, we'll follow the student himself, the young man stepping nervously into his new life, cloak wrapped tight, parchment under his arm, heart full of hope. Leaving home, dreams, and hardships. Picture a narrow road in medieval Europe. Muddy, uneven, lined with hedges and the occasional crumbling milestone left over from Roman times. Along this road trudges a boy, or perhaps a very young man. He carries a small bundle of belongings, a cloak, a loaf of bread, a little money if he's lucky, and maybe a scrap of parchment tied with string. He's leaving home to chase a dream, to study at the university. The call of learning for many. This decision began with encouragement from a village priest or a family proud enough to send their brightest child away. Universities had become symbols of hope. If you studied law, you might rise to serve a prince or bishop. If you mastered theology, perhaps you would preach before kings. Even a modest degree could open doors in the church or administration. But first you had to leave behind everything you knew: your parents, your fields, your little town, and set out into the unknown. The journey travel was not easy. There were no trains, no maps neatly printed with routes. Instead, there were long paths through forests, crowded market roads, and the constant fear of bandits. Students often traveled in groups, joining merchant caravans or pilgrims for safety. They carried letters from their priests to show they were scholars, not vagabonds. Still, the risk of being robbed or worse was very real. Nights were spent in monasteries, roadside inns, or under the stars. Imagine trying to keep your parchment safe when rain poured down, or mice nibbled at your bag. For a student, every scrap of writing was precious, sometimes worth more than gold. The first glimpse of the city after weeks of travel, the city finally appeared on the horizon. Paris, Bologna, or Oxford each looked enormous to the eyes of a village boy. Towers of churches rose above crowded houses. Smoke drifted from hundreds of chimneys. Bells rang out across the air. But with the excitement came nerves. The city was loud, smelly, and overwhelming. Horses clattered on stone streets, merchants shouted in markets, beggars tugged at cloaks, and somewhere, hidden among all that chaos, were the halls of learning. Finding a place to stay, this was the first challenge. Students didn't arrive to neat dormitories or cozy boarding houses. They had to find lodgings with local landlords, often greedy ones. Rooms were small, dark, and cold. A bed, if you were lucky, was a wooden frame stuffed with straw. Rent was high, food extra, and landlords had no mercy if you fell behind on payment. Many students found themselves huddled together, pooling coins, eating stale bread, and drinking weak ale to stay warm. If you wanted to study, you first had to survive. Homesickness? Let's not forget, these were young men, some only 14 or 15. They had left behind mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends. Letters took weeks to travel. Many never returned home until years later, if at all. Some cried in silence at night, others distracted themselves with new friends and adventures. But all of them felt the tug of home, the language's barrier. Everything at the university was in Latin, not the smooth classical Latin of Cicero, but the rough medieval Latin of scholars. For a boy from the countryside, this could be terrifying. He might know some prayers and hymns, but now he had to argue complex ideas in a foreign tongue. Mispronounce a word, and your classmates would roar with laughter. It was like being dropped into a world where your voice always sounded clumsy. And yet, over time, Latin became second nature. It turned the university into an international place. A German student could debate with a Spaniard, a Frenchman with an Englishman. Latin was their bridge. Money troubles. Money was always tight. Many students came from poor families. They stretched every coin, skipping meals, or begging local monasteries for scraps. Some took on tutoring jobs, teaching younger boys to read or chant psalms. Others wrote letters for townsfolk or copied texts for a fee. There were also scholarships, what we might call benefits. A wealthy bishop might sponsor a promising student, or a town might support its brightest son, hoping he would return as a lawyer or priest. But for most, poverty was a constant companion. Temptations of the cities offered distractions, sometimes dangerous ones. Taverns were full of laughter, ale, and music. Dice games clattered on tables. Troubadours sang of love and war. Some students got swept away in the fun, spending their rents on drink. Others ended up in fights with townsfolk, earning a reputation as rowdy troublemakers. The line between scholar and rascal was often thin. Chronicles even tell us of students who joined riots, broke into bakeries, or dueled in the streets. Not everyone made it to graduation. Some failed, some gave up, and some disappeared entirely into the chaos of the city. Friendships and brotherhood, yet there was also deep companionship. Students shared struggles, borrowed notes, and comforted each other through hard winters. They formed nation student groups based on where they came from. A boy from Normandy joined the Norman nation, while one from England joined the English. These groups provided support and protection, like families in a strange land. Late at night, by candlelight, students whispered their hopes, to become priests, judges, or simply wise men. Dreams burned brighter when shared with friends. The first taste of learning. After all the hardships, the hunger, the homesickness, the cold came the reward. The first time a student sat in a hall, listening to a master read from an ancient book, something stirred inside. Words written centuries earlier came alive. Questions bubbled. Ideas sparked. This was why he had left home. For knowledge, for wisdom, for the chance to see beyond the fields and barns of his childhood, into the vast world of thought. A step into a new life, so we leave our young scholar at the threshold of this new life. He has survived the journey, found a room, made friends, and endured loneliness. Ahead lie years of study, discipline, and growth. He is no longer just a boy from a small village. He is part of something bigger, a universitas, a community of learners spread across Europe. His hardships have only begun, but so too has his adventure. The classroom, candlelight, parchment, and lectures. The student wakes up before dawn. The bells of the city clang in the cold morning air, echoing off stone walls. He stumbles out of his narrow bed, wraps himself in his cloak, and hurries down crooked streets toward the place where lessons are held. This isn't a grand university campus with gardens and towers. It might be a rented hall, a chapel corner, or even a master's own house. Yet here, in this smoky, chilly room, the magic of medieval learning begins. The setting: imagine stepping into the classroom. The walls are bare stone, damp with morning mist. A few wooden benches creak under the weight of students. The air smells of wax, sweat, and smoke from flickering candles. At the front, a heavy desk stands piled with books, real treasures. Since each one has been copied by hand on parchment, it's not comfortable, it's not warm, but this is where minds are shaped. The master's arrival at last. The master enters. He wears a long robe, perhaps frayed at the edges, and his beard shows signs of sleepless nights. He is respected, even feared. Students scramble to quiet down, quills ready, parchments spread before them. The lesson begins with the Lectio, the lecture. The master reads aloud from a text in Latin, carefully pronouncing each word. Sometimes it's Aristotle, sometimes the Bible, sometimes an ancient Roman law. These books are too precious for every student to own. Listening is everything. The work of parchment? Parchment is not paper tits. Animal skin, scraped smooth, cut into sheets, expensive, rare, and fragile. Students treat it with care, though ink stains and quill scratches often betray clumsy hands. A small mistake could mean ruining an entire page. Copying notes is slow, back-breaking work. No laptops, no printers, no quick erasing. Every word must be written carefully, with pauses to trim the quill or dip it into ink. The sound of scratching fills the room, mingling with the droning Latin of the master. Sometimes students doodled in the margins tiny faces, animals, even jokes. Imagine sitting for hours in a freezing hall, your nose dripping, and not being tempted to draw a silly monster next to Aristotle's name. They were human, after all. The rhythm of learning the Lectio is one part of the day. Another is the disputa thutha debate. Here, students question the master, challenge each other, and argue about meaning. Picture two young scholars standing up, cloaks swirling, voices rising. One insists that reason can explain faith, the other shouts that faith goes beyond reason. The master listens, sometimes smiling, sometimes interrupting with a sharp correction. The room grows hot with words, even as the air stays cold. Arguments can last hours. It's not about who wins, but about sharpening minds. This was medieval training for public speaking, for law courts, for pulpits. The subjects, what did they study? At first, the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. These were the foundations. Grammar taught how to handle Latin correctly. Rhetoric trained students to persuade with words. Logic drilled them in reasoning, turning their minds into sharp tools. Once those were mastered, the quadrivium followed. Arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Don't imagine music as strumming a lute. It was the study of harmony and proportion, linked to the stars themselves. Astronomy wasn't just planets and comets, it was about how the heavens reflected divine order. Beyond this came the higher faculties, law in Bologna, theology in Paris, and philosophy or medicine in Oxford. Each path carried weight, each could shape a life. The atmosphere now, close your eyes and listen. The scratching of quills, the steady Latin of the master, the occasional sneeze or cough echoing in the stone room, the smell of tallow candles, their smoke clinging to cloaks and hair, the drip of water leaking from the roof. It was not glamorous, but for the students, it was thrilling. To sit in the same room as a master, to hear ideas spoken aloud, to be part of something that felt bigger than themselves, that was worth the cold and discomfort. Exams and tests. Examinations were nothing like today's. Forget multiple choice sheets or essays. Instead, students faced oral defenses. You stood before your master, sometimes for hours, answering questions, reciting texts, and proving your knowledge. Nerves shook many young men, voices cracked, sweaty palms clutched cloaks. And if you failed the books, but if you passed, the sense of victory was immense. It was like standing on top of the world, at least, the small world of your university. Discipline in class not all went smoothly. Some students nodded off in lectures, others whispered, passed notes, or sneaked out early. The masters weren't afraid to scold. Chronicles tell of punishments ranging from fines to public humiliation, but often, the greatest punishment was shame. To be known as a lazy scholar was worse than being king, and your peers would laugh, and your reputation could suffer. In a place where honor mattered, that was a heavy blow. The long day classes went from dawn until evening bells. In between there was little rest. Students snatched meals of bread and ale, huddled over notes, or ran across town to the next disputation. Candles burned late into the night as they copied, memorized, and prepared. Some nights they fell asleep over parchment, ink smudging across their faces. Other nights, arguments carried on long after lectures, with friends debating in taverns until voices grew hoarse. The feeling of belonging despite the hardship. There was a sense of belonging. To sit in a medieval classroom was to be part of a chain stretching back to ancient Greece and Rome. The words of Aristotle, Boethius, and Augustine passed from master to student, and then onward again. Our young scholar, freezing in his seat, felt that he was part of something bigger than himself. The classroom was not just a room, it was a doorway into the great conversation of mankind. The scratch of the quill. Let us end with a sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The quill dragging across parchment, the master's voice echoing in Latin. The flicker of a candle casting shadows on damp stone walls. This was the heartbeat of the medieval classroom. Not glamorous, not easy, but unforgettable. Here, in these rough rooms, the foundations of modern learning were laid. Debates and disputations. The art of arguing. If lectures were the bread of university life, then debates, the disputations, were the spice. They added fire, flavor, and sometimes a little too much heat. This was the medieval art of arguing, and it wasn't just shouting at each other in taverns, though students did plenty of that too. No, disputations were formal, serious, and yet strangely theatrical. What is a disputation? At its heart, a disputation was an intellectual duel. A master posed a question, something big, thorny, and difficult. Then students or fellow scholars had to defend one side while others attacked it. The goal wasn't always to find the right answer, but to test reasoning, logic, and quick thinking. Imagine being told, does faith require reason? Or is faith beyond reason? Or, is the world eternal? Or did it have a beginning? These weren't easy dinner table chats. They were puzzles that stretched the mind. The setup: picture the hall. Benches are full, the smell of damp cloaks and tallow candles fills the air. Students lean forward, parchment ready to jot notes. At the front, the master sits in a high-backed chair like a judge. His face is stern, but there's a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. On one side stands the student tasked with defending the argument, on the other stands the challenger of the opponents. Cloaks swish, voices clear, and the disputation begins. The rules of the game, unlike modern debates, this wasn't a free-for-all. The disputation followed strict rules. The opponents asked carefully crafted questions, aiming to trap the respondents in contradictions. The respondents had to answer quickly, without faltering, using logic and authority from texts. All of it was in Latin, of course. No room for slang or stuttering. A slip of the tongue could cost you your reputation. And the master he watched, intervened, and at the end delivered the determinatio, a summary of the arguments, and his own judgment. The thrill of arguing now. Imagine you are the respondia, your heart is pounding, your palms are sweaty, and 50 pairs of eyes are staring at you. The opponent throws a question. If God is perfect, how can humans, being imperfect, ever understand him? Your mind races. You recall Augustine, Aristotle, maybe a note you scribbled last week. You open your mouth and speak, praying your Latin doesn't betray you. When you manage a solid reply, your classmates nod. A wave of relief floods you. For a moment, you're not just a scared student or a thinker, a voice in a grand tradition. The noise and the energy. Don't think disputations were dull. They were lively, fiery, sometimes even chaotic. Voices rose. Students murmured. Some even chuckled when someone fumbled. One chronicler complained that disputations often turned into boisterous displays, where students cared more about showing off than seeking truth. And honestly, that sounds about right. Young men, a captive audience, and a stage. What else could happen? Everyday topics. Not every disputation was about the deepest mysteries of the universe. Some were surprisingly practical. For law students in Bologna, debates might revolve around Roman legal codes. If a man borrows a cow, and it dies, who is responsible, the borrower or the owner? For medical students, the topics were biological. Does blood circulate continuously, or is it produced and consumed? Spoiler, they didn't have the right answer yet. Theology students, of course, loved to wrestle with angels, grace, and sin, and sometimes they debated questions that sound almost whimsical today, like do angels take up space? Or could God have created more than one world? The role of logic. Logic was the sword of disputation. Students drilled endlessly in syllogisms. If A, then B, if B, then C. Therefore A means C. It sounds dry, but in the heat of debate, logic was your shield. Without it, you'd be torn apart by sharper minds. Medieval people took logic seriously. They believed it was a way to glimpse divine truth. To argue well was not just cleverness, it was almost a sacred act. The audience, disputations drew crowds. Students packed the halls, not always to learn, but sometimes just to enjoy the show. Think of it as medieval intellectual theater. A witty answer could win cheers. A clumsy mistake might spark laughter. Some masters became famous for their disputations, drawing audiences like rock stars of the academic world. Imagine Thomas Aquinas or Abelard, surrounded by eager students, voices booming in smoky halls. The humbling experience, of course, not everyone shone. Many students stammered, froze, or collapsed under pressure. Some left the hall red-faced, mocked by peers. But this humiliation was part of the training. You learned to think on your feet, to defend yourself, to sharpen your words like blades. And little by little, even the weakest students grew stronger. Disputations were hard, but they toughened minds. Beyond the classroom, these debates spilled into taverns, streets, and dorm rooms. Students argued over mugs of ale, scribbled notes on scraps of parchment, or rehearsed clever answers with friends. Some never stopped arguing, carrying disputes into their adult lives as lawyers, priests, or politicians. In a way, disputation shaped the entire medieval culture of dialogue. It wasn't about shouting each other down, it was about testing truth through fire. The bigger picture, looking back, disputations may sound strange, maybe even exhausting, but they trained generations of thinkers. Without them, there would be no medieval scholasticism, no foundations for modern philosophy, law, or science. So next time you see a university debate club, remember, they read the great-grandchildren of those candlelit halls where young men wrestled with angels and cows alike. The end of a debate. As the disputation ends, the master leans forward. His voice cuts through the murmurs, calm and steady. He praises sharp answers, notes weaknesses, and delivers the conclusion. The students sigh in relief, stretch their cramped legs, and shuffle out into the cold evening air. Some are proud, some embarrassed, all of them hungry for food, for rest, for more knowledge. The disputation is over, but the echoes linger in their minds. Words spoken in candlelight have a way of staying with you. Subjects of study, trivium, quadrivium, and beyond, our young scholar has survived his first disputations, copied his first messy notes, and spent enough evenings staring at flickering candles to develop sore eyes. But what exactly did he study? What knowledge filled those cold halls and heavy books? Let's step into the medieval curriculum, the ladder of learning, rung by rung. The trivium, the first rung. Every student began with the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. 3 simple-sounding subjects, but together they were like sharpening the mind's sword. Grammar was not just spelling and commas. It was mastery of Latin, the language of learning, law, and prayer. Without Latin, a student was helpless, like a knight without a sword. They memorized rules, recited verses, and copied texts until Latin flowed more smoothly than their mother tongue. Rhetoric taught persuasion. It wasn't about giving fiery speeches in taverns, though some tried. It was about shaping arguments, arranging words with elegance, and speaking in a way that could sway hearts or judges. A good rhetorician could win debates, court cases, or even political favor. Logic was the crown of the trivium. Students drilled in syllogisms until they dreamed in if A, then B. It was mental gymnastics, but also practical. If you could argue well, you could defend your faith, your legal case, or your philosophy. Finishing the trivium didn't make you a genius, but it gave you tools. Without it, you couldn't climb higher. The quadrivium, the next step. Once you mastered the trivium, you could tackle the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These four weren't random. Together, they represented harmony, the order of creation itself. Arithmetic was more than adding numbers. It was seen as the study of pure quantity, the foundation of all science. Geometry wasn't just drawing shapes, it was surveying land, understanding space, and even imagining the architecture of cathedrals. Music was not strumming a lute in taverns. It was mathematical ratios, scales, harmony. Medieval students believed music reflected the balance of the universe, a cosmic song playing through creation. Astronomy was more mystical than modern science. Yes, they tracked stars and planets, but they also believed the heavens revealed divine order. To study the skies was to study God's blueprint. Together, the quadrivium pointed students upward from words and arguments toward numbers and the cosmos. Beyond the basics, the higher faculties, for many, the trivium and quadrivium were just the beginning. The real prestige came from the higher faculties: law, medicine, and theology. Law was king in Bologna. Students pored over Roman codes, learning how to resolve disputes about land, money, and inheritance. A skilled lawyer could serve princes, popes, or city councils. Medicine attracted students eager to heal, but beware, this wasn't modern medicine. They read Hippocrates and Galen, memorized theories about the four humors, and studied astrology to diagnose illnesses. Still, universities helped professionalize doctors who were badly needed in plague-ridden towns. Theology was the queen of sciences, especially in Paris. This was the study of God, scripture, and the soul. It was the most respected field, producing names like Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard. To become a theologian was to become a guardian of truth itself. These higher studies were long, difficult, and expensive, but they carried honor and opened the door to powerful careers. The long hours learning wasn't quick. Students memorized texts, word for word, argued them in disputations, and copied endless notes. Without printing presses, knowledge moved slowly, one page at a time. Imagine spending weeks memorizing Aristotle's categories, only to stumble over a single definition in disputation, or burning your last candle late at night while trying to grasp why circles mattered to the harmony of the heavens. It was exhausting, but also thrilling. The challenge of relevance. Did every student care deeply about astronomy or the humors of medicine? Of course not. Some groaned when masters droned on about ratios. Others secretly wondered, how will this help me when I'm hungry? But the structure mattered. These subjects weren't just information, they trained the mind to think in order, harmony, and clarity. They believed learning shaped the soul, not just the wallet. Different cities, different strengths, each great university had its specialty. Paris was theology's shining star. Students flocked there to hear great masters interpret scripture and debate philosophy. Bologna was the empire of law, famous for dusty scrolls of Roman statutes and eager young lawyers. Oxford offered a balance, with strong traditions in philosophy and eventually science. A student chose his path carefully, depending on his calling or sometimes just where a scholarship could be found. The ladder of learning. The medieval curriculum might sound rigid, but it was like a ladder. Each rung prepared you for the next, and climbing it was a test of endurance. From grammar to rhetoric, logic to astronomy, and finally law, medicine, or theology, you grew not just in knowledge, but in discipline. Not every student made it to the top. Many dropped out after the trivium, returning home with enough Latin and logic to secure a good job. But those who climbed higher became the scholars, priests, doctors, and lawyers who shaped Europe's future. A scholar's reflection. Imagine our young scholar, sitting by candlelight after another long day. His parchment is filled with scribbles on silk. His mind aches from trying to grasp the harmony of music and the movements of stars. He sighs, stretches his cold fingers, and looks around at his fellow students. They are tired too, but proud, for they are part of something rare, something powerful, the pursuit of knowledge. Closing thought. The trivium, the quadrivium, the higher faculties, they weren't just dusty lists of subjects. They were stepping stones on a path to wisdom, and though the students often grumbled, fought sleep, or doodled silly monsters in the margins, they were laying the foundation of the modern world. Knowledge in those stone halls was not simply taught, it was forged like iron in fire, slow, difficult, and enduring. Tools of learning, parchment, quills, and candles. If the medieval university was a battlefield of ideas, then students needed their weapons. But don't picture shiny swords or armored shields. No, their tools were humbler, quieter, and often messier. Parchment, quills, ink, and candlelight. These were the faithful companions of every scholar's journey. Parchment, the canvas of knowledge. Before paper was common in Europe, parchment ruled the classroom. Made from animal skin, usually sheep, calf, or goat, it was tough, durable, and expensive. A single sheet might cost more than a student's monthly meals. Preparing parchment wasn't glamorous. Skins had to be soaked, stretched, scraped, and rubbed until they were smooth enough to write on. You could sometimes still see faint marks of veins or hair. Scholars joked that the pages themselves had lived harder lives than the students. Because parchment was so costly, students often reused it. Old texts were scraped off to make palimpsests, pages with ghostly words underneath the new writing. Imagine copying Aristotle while faint bits of a prayer or poem peeked through the surface. A strange layering of voices from the past. Owning books wasn't realistic for most students. Instead, they rented petchacopies, sections of texts, split up and loaned out like puzzle pieces. Copying them carefully was part of a student's daily grind. Quills. The scholar's sword. A knight had his sword, but a student had his quill. Made from goose or swan feathers, quills had to be trimmed and sharpened constantly. Ink wore them down quickly, so students kept knives handy not for duels in the courtyard, but for shaping their pens. Writing with a quill was a delicate art. Too much pressure, and the feather splattered ink across the parchment. Too little, and the words faded into whispers. And don't even ask what happened if you sneezed mid-sentence. Some manuscripts today still carry tiny blots and scratches, a silent testimony to centuries-old accidents. Quills weren't fast, notes were slow to take, and mistakes were hard to fix. Yet this slowness also made writing thoughtful. Each word demanded care, each page patience. Ink, the liquid treasure, of course. A quill was useless without ink. Medieval ink was usually made from oak galls, strange growths on trees caused by wasps. These were crushed, mixed with iron salts, and boiled into a dark, lasting fluid. Add a bit of gum for stickiness, and voila ink that could outlast centuries. But not all ink behaved. Some faded, some smudged, some even ate into the parchment over time. Students never knew if their hard work would survive or vanish into brown stains. Carrying ink was a hazard too. A spilled pot could ruin weeks of notes in seconds. Perhaps more than one scholar's temper was tested by an overturned inkwell on a crowded desk. Candles light in the darkness. The medieval university day didn't end at sunset. Lessons and debates stretched late, and homework waited long after. Candles, therefore, were essential. Most students couldn't afford the fancy beeswax candles used in churches. They relied on cheaper tallow candles made from animal fat. These smoked, smelled, and dripped, leaving stains on parchment and noses alike. Worse, they burned quickly, forcing students to ration their hours of study. Picture a dorm room, 3 students huddled over one candle, each leaning dangerously close, shadows dancing across the page. Eyes strained, backs ached, but the work continued. Without candlelight, the medieval university would have been silent after dusk. Margins, the playground of the pen. Even with serious studies, students couldn't resist doodling. Margins of manuscripts are filled with sketches, little knights, dragons, silly faces, or sarcastic comments about the text. A master might thunder about Aristotle's logic, while a student quietly sketched a rabbit in armor in the corner of his notes. Centuries later, these doodles give us a window into their boredom, humor, and humanity. Book, chests, and desks. Books were so valuable that universities kept them chained in libraries. Students lucky enough to access one had to copy what they needed, hunched over narrow desks. In dorms, a student's desk was often just a plank across a pair of supports. Tools, parchment scraps, quills, ink pots cluttered the surface. A small chest might hold precious books or notes. Losing one was a disaster. Forget misplacing your phone, imagine losing a semester's worth of handwritten Aristotle. The smell of study life with parchment, ink, and tallow candles had a certain aroma. Animal skin, smoky candles, and sour ink mixed into a scent that clung to clothes and hair. Students probably carried the perfume of scholarship wherever they went. The struggle and the charm. These tools were far from perfect. Quills broke, candles guttered, ink spilled, parchment tore. Study was slow, messy, and frustrating, but there was also beauty in it. The act of writing felt permanent, almost sacred. Each word carved into parchment seemed to echo across centuries. And in a way, it did. Many of the texts copied by those weary students survive today, scratched, blotched, and glowing faintly under library lights. Their tools may seem crude to us, but they carried knowledge across generations. Our scholars, imagine our student, late at night, scratching his quill across parchment. His ink runs low, his candle sputters. The room smells of wax and smoke. He yawns but keeps writing, because tomorrow's disputation looms. His fingers are stained with ink, his parchment edges are smudged, and the margins already hold a doodle of a tiny dragon breathing fire on a professor. He sighs, blows gently on the fresh words, and leans back. The tools of his trade are humble, but with them, he builds a bridge between himself and eternity. Closing thought: the parchment, the quill, the ink, the candle, they were not just tools. They were companions, frustrating and loyal, clumsy and essential. They slowed students down, but perhaps that slowness made the knowledge sink deeper. Every blot, every stain, every scrap of parchment was part of the great experiment of learning. And thanks to these tools, the flicker of candlelight in medieval dorms still glows faintly today. In every library where those ancient pages rest. Student life, dormitories, meals, and mischief. If lectures and debates filled the daylight hours, then student life after class was a whole other adventure. Dormitories, food, and, let's be honest, plenty of mischief shaped the rhythm of medieval universities. Our young scholar may have been chasing wisdom, but he was also chasing a warm bed, a decent meal, and the occasional bit of fun. Dormitories, more straw than comfort. Forget soft mattresses, clean sheets, and quiet study lamps. Medieval students often shared cramped lodgings in noisy, drafty houses. Beds were little more than straw stuffed into sacks, sometimes shared between two students if money was tight. Straw had to be changed regularly, or else it became a paradise for fleas. And fleas, sadly, showed no respect for scholars of Aristotle. The walls of student quarters were thin. Through them you might hear the neighbor rehearsing a sermon, arguing with a roommate, or worse, snoring. And if your room happened to be above a tavern, well then, you were lucky if you got any sleep at all. Furniture was scarce. A plank served as a desk, a chest doubled as both storage and chair, and shelves were often improvised. Some students even lived with local families, squeezing into attics or back rooms for a few coins a month. Privacy was rare. Noise was guaranteed. Meals, bread, ale, and more bread. University dining was hardly luxurious. Students depended on simple fare. Coarse bread, cheese, pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables were cheap, and, of course, ale. Water was often unsafe, so ale became the everyday drink, even at breakfast. Meat was a luxury. Fish was more common, especially on fast days, when the church required abstinence. Poorer students sometimes ate scraps from taverns or bought stale bread at the end of the market day, and if your purse was really empty, you might find yourself skipping meals altogether. Dining halls existed at some colleges, but many students cooked their own food in tiny, smoky hearths. Meals weren't just about eating, they were also moments of chatter, gossip, and jokes. Bread crusts became drumsticks on the table, and ale loosened tongues enough for mock debates and friendly teasing. The alehouses and taverns, of course. Not all meals were eaten soberly in the dorm. Taverns dotted the streets around every university. Cheap ale, hot food, and a roaring fire drew students like moths to a candle. Inside, you'd find long wooden benches, noisy laughter, dice games, and songs echoing against smoky rafters. It wasn't unusual for heated debates to spill from the lecture hall into the tavern, where Aristotle might share the stage with drunken storytelling and jokes about professors' bald spots. But taverns were double-edged swords. They offered fun and escape, but they also drained wallets and fueled trouble. Too much ale led to brawls in the street, and universities often scolded their students for rowdiness. Of course, rules didn't stop anyone from sneaking out after curfew. Mischief and pranks. University students had a reputation for being mischievous, sometimes downright unruly. Think less quiet scholars in robes, and more rowdy teenagers with too much energy. Pranks were common. A favorite trick was to steal a friend's shoes while he slept, leaving him to scramble around barefoot the next morning. Others slipped frogs into classmates' beds or smeared ink across doorknobs. On feast days, students might parade through the streets in mock processions, dressing up in costumes and singing silly songs. But not all mischief was harmless. Rivalries between groups of students or between students and townsfolk could explode into full-blown fights. Stones, sticks, and even knives sometimes entered the fray. Authorities regularly complained about riotous scholars disturbing the peace. Imagine your roommate coming home from class with ink-stained hands one day and a black eye the next. Relations with townsfolk. The bond between students and local townsfolk was complicated. Students brought money to cities, filling taverns, markets, and inns, but they also had a knack for offending locals with their arrogance, noise, and pranks. Quarrels broke out often. A dispute over the price of bread could escalate into an all-out riot. Townspeople mocked students as spoiled troublemakers, while students dismissed locals as uneducated bores. Some friendships did form, of course. Students lodged with families, fell in love with local girls, and even married into towns. But overall, tension between town and gown was a constant theme of medieval university life. Rules, discipline, and curfews to tame student mischief. Universities imposed strict rules. Curfews required students to be indoors by a certain hour. Gambling was forbidden, as was carrying weapons, though many ignored this. Attending mass was mandatory. Breaking rules could lead to fines, public scolding, or even expulsion. Some universities had their own prison cells for unruly students. Still, discipline wasn't perfect. Clever scholars always found ways to slip past watchmen, sneak into taverns, or disguise their mischief as academic exercises. Friendships and camaraderie despite hardships and scoldings. Student life built strong bonds. Sharing cramped rooms, enduring cold nights, splitting loaves of bread, and pulling all-nighters by candlelight created friendships that lasted a lifetime. Students debated together, prayed together, and sometimes fought side by side in street scuffles. They called each other brother, not just out of politeness, but because the struggle of learning bound them like family. There's something endearing about imagining a group of students, huddled under blankets in a drafty attic, whispering jokes by the light of a single candle, while outside the city bells tolled midnight, a day in the life. So, picture our scholar's evening. He finishes a lecture, copies notes until his quill scratches no more, then trudges back to his lodging. His roommate is already there, warming stale bread by the hearth. They share a quick meal, laughing at a professor's pompous Latin. Later, they slip into a tavern, singing too loudly, before staggering back to their dorm at curfew, dodging the watchman's lantern. Back in their straw beds, they whisper one last joke before fleas remind them of their presence. Sleep finally comes, mingled with the scent of ale, smoke, and ink. Closing thought: dormitories, meals, and mischief were not just side stories, they were the real heartbeat of student life. The cramped beds, the shared bread, the laughter, and the trouble gave flavor to the learning. They remind us that medieval scholars weren't only thinkers under candlelight, they were also young people, full of energy, flaws, and joy, making the most of their fleeting student days. Masters and students, relationships, respect, and rebellion. When we picture a medieval classroom, we often imagine rows of obedient students, hanging on to every word of a wise, gray-haired master. And yes, there was plenty of respect in the relationship between teachers and students. But there was also tension, frustration, and even rebellion. The bond was complicated, like a mix of father, boss, preacher, and sometimes, enemy. The master, keeper of wisdom, a medieval master wasn't just a teacher, he was a gatekeeper of knowledge, a guide through the thick forest of theology, law, and philosophy. Masters lectured in Latin, the language of scholarship. Their job was to read a sacred or authoritative text aloud, then explain and comment on it. Many students adored their masters, copying their words carefully and imitating their style of thought. A good master could make Aristotle's logic feel like an unfolding mystery. A bad one, well, imagine a monotone voice reading endless sentences in Latin while students slowly dozed off. Some things never change. Respect and rituals. Respect for masters was built into the university culture. Students bowed when entering the hall, listened in silence, and stood when addressed. Disrespect was a serious offense. After all, these men were not only teachers but often priests, doctors of theology, or trained lawyers. Still, respect didn't mean students always behaved. Just like today, whispers, doodles, and the occasional smirk broke the solemn mood. And if a master's lecture dragged on too long, students might accidentally drop a book or cough loudly until he wrapped things up. The bachelor and the doctor, the hierarchy of teachers, mattered. At the bottom were bachelor's junior teachers, still proving themselves. Above them were doctors and masters of faculties, seasoned scholars with authority. Students knew the difference. Bachelors were closer in age and often more approachable, sometimes even sharing tavern tables after class. Doctors, however, carried weight and prestige, and their words echoed like law. A student who impressed a doctor could open doors to future positions. Student attitudes, admiration, and annoyance for many students, masters were inspiring. They were living proof of what education could achieve. Respected voices, well-dressed in academic robes, confident in speech. But admiration didn't erase frustration. Students often complained about boring lectures, harsh discipline, and impossible assignments. Some masters recycled the same lectures for decades, their notes older than the students listening. Others refused to explain things in plain language, making knowledge feel like a locked chest. So while respect was the rule, eye-rolling and muttered complaints were never far behind. Rebellion in the ranks. Sometimes, student discontent boiled over into open rebellion. Entire groups of students walked out of lectures if they felt mistreated. Strikes weren't uncommon. In Paris, students once refused to attend classes for years after a conflict with the city authorities. Disputes weren't always about teaching. Masters controlled grading, discipline, and even moral conduct. Students who felt unfairly punished sometimes banded together to protest. After all, what good is brotherhood if you can't use it against a strict master now and then? Masters as mentors. Yet the story wasn't all rebellion. For many students, their master was a lifelong mentor. He guided them through exams, advised them on careers, and sometimes recommended them to noble patrons or church leaders. Masters also protected students from town authorities. When locals complained about noisy students, it was often a master who defended them, arguing that scholars were under the jurisdiction of the university, not the city. This protective role gave masters a fatherly image, even if they were sometimes strict. Shared hardships. We shouldn't forget that masters and students often lived under similar conditions. Cold lecture halls, smoky candles, endless text. Professors endured much of the same discomfort. They too had to sharpen quills, read by candlelight, and debate in freezing weather. This shared struggle sometimes drew teachers and students closer. After all, who else could understand the pain of reading Aristotle's Metaphysics by the light of a dripping tallow candle? Punishments and discipline. When respect broke down, discipline followed. A student who mocked his master could face fines, expulsion, or public humiliation. Sometimes students were required to apologize in front of the whole class, but masters themselves weren't untouchable. If they abused their authority or taught poorly, students could complain to the university. In extreme cases, a master could lose his right to teach. It was a delicate balance of power-authority, tempered by accountability. The lighter side of the relationship. Not every interaction was solemn or tense. Humor found its way into classrooms too. Students joked about their professors' habits, one always losing his place in a book, another constantly mispronouncing a Latin phrase. Some masters had a playful side themselves. They posed trick questions in disputations, teased students during oral exams, or slipped jokes into lectures to keep everyone awake. For a brief moment, the dusty hall would echo with laughter instead of yawns. A day in class, let's picture it. Our scholar trudges into the lecture hall, bows politely to the master, and finds a seat on the hard bench. The master, robed in black, begins reading from a worn manuscript. His voice rises and falls in Latin phrases, punctuated by explanations. Some students scribble notes furiously, others doodle in the margins. One stifles a yawn. The master pauses, peers over his spectacles, and asks a pointed question. Silence falls. Finally, a nervous student stands, fumbling through an answer. The master nods, satisfied, and the rhythm resumes. Respect is there, but so is fatigue, boredom, and the occasional spark of rebellion. This was the dance of medieval classrooms. Closing thought. The bond between masters and students was never simple. It mixed reverence with frustration, obedience with resistance, and seriousness with laughter. Together, they built the tradition of teaching that still shapes universities today. In the flickering light of the lecture hall, beneath the stern gaze of a master, students found both discipline and inspiration. And sometimes, when courage burned bright, they also found their voices in rebellion. The nations of students, brotherhoods, and rivalries. Medieval universities weren't just places of learning, they were little cities of their own. And just like any city, students formed groups, alliances, and rivalries. These were called nations, and they shaped everything from daily life to disputes, friendships, and even mischief. What were the nations? A nation was not a country, at least not exactly. It was a group of students who shared a common place of origin, like all the Parisians, all the Florentines, or all the Scots. Students were strangers in a bustling city, often far from home, so nations provided a sense of identity, protection, and camaraderie. Joining a nation meant you had allies, someone to share meals with, warn you of angry townsfolk, or lend you a spare cloak when your own was soaked through. For students traveling hundreds of miles, it was like bringing a piece of home along. Structure and leadership. Each nation had its own leaders and rules. There might be a head representative, called a rector, responsible for organizing the group and negotiating with the university authorities. Smaller officers handled day-to-day matters, like dividing duties, collecting dues, or arranging dormitory space. Some nations were large, with hundreds of students. Others were tiny, with just a handful. Size didn't matter as much as loyalty. Students protected each other fiercely, and crossing the wrong nation could be dangerous. The benefits of belonging. Being part of a nation had many perks. Students received social support, help with lodging, and sometimes even legal assistance. Disputes with other students or even townspeople were often handled collectively. Nations also organized practical matters, shared meals, pooled funds for books or parchment, and protection on long walks home after dark. Life in a medieval city could be risky, so having a network of fellow countrymen was comforting. Friendship and rivalry, of course. Nations weren't all harmonious. Rivalries ran deep, sometimes erupting in street fights, tavern brawls, or pranks. Students from different nations competed for prestige, arguing over who was the cleverest, the loudest, or the best debater. Think of it as a medieval version of college rivalries today, but with more ink, more swords occasionally, and fewer safe words. Some rivalries lasted for decades, passed from senior students to newcomers, becoming part of the university's folklore. Pranks and mischief. Mischief was often national in scope. Imagine a French nation sneaking into the dorms of Italian students, swapping bedding with straw, or replacing ink with soot. In the streets, mock battles might break out, with banners waving, chants echoing, and townsfolk running for cover. Masters and authorities tried to curb this chaos, but enforcement was tricky. After all, hundreds of spirited young men, all far from home, found clever ways to bend the rules. The nations gave them strength in numbers and a sense of invincibility. Rituals and celebrations, nations weren't all about disputes. They celebrated feast days, welcomed newcomers, and honored seniors. Sometimes they held processions through the city streets, singing, joking, and displaying banners. During these occasions, the city might shake with laughter and music. Even serious theology students could be seen dancing in the streets, their robes swirling, candles flickering, and noses painted with flour from tavern pranks. The role in academic life. Nations also influenced academics. They could support students in debates, prepare them for examinations, and ensure that newcomers learned the ropes. If a student struggled in lectures, his nation might tutor him, help copy notes, or explain a tricky text. In many ways, nations functioned like early fraternities, minus the beer pong well. Sometimes there was beer. They combined friendship, protection, guidance, and a little chaos, creating a social glue that held student communities together. Conflicts with townsfolk. Nations occasionally caused trouble with the city itself. Too much noise, too many pranks, or an ill-timed street brawl could spark complaints. In Paris, for example, tensions between students and townspeople sometimes escalated into riots. A single insult could trigger weeks of disputes, with entire nations taking sides. Sometimes a city official would try to discipline a student, only to face the united front of his nation. In these moments, student solidarity proved powerful and occasionally terrifying. Life lessons in brotherhood. Being part of a nation taught students more than just loyalty. They learned negotiation, leadership, and diplomacy. They discovered the value of collective action, the consequences of mischief, and the importance of reputation. Our young scholar, far from home, would find comfort and identity within his nation. Even if he got into trouble, he knew his fellow countrymen had his back. They shared bread, quills, and mischief in equal measure, and together, they navigated the chaotic streets of medieval cities. A day in the life of a nation. Picture our scholar walking through a bustling city with his nation. He greets familiar faces, trades jokes, and shares bread. A minor quarrel with another nation sparks playful shoving, quickly broken up by the rector. Later, they gather in a tavern, arguing over who can recite the most lines from Aristotle or Boethius. Laughter erupts when someone misquotes a Latin phrase. The evening ends with a quiet walk home, lanterns flickering, cloaks swaying, and the sense that, no matter how chaotic life gets, you are not alone. Closing thought. The nations of students were more than social clubs. They were lifelines. They offered friendship, protection, mischief, and lessons that extended far beyond the classroom. In their unity and rivalry, they mirrored the complexity of the medieval world, harsh, spirited, and full of life. For our scholar, belonging to a nation meant more than safety. It meant identity, support, and the joy of shared experience. In the chaotic, candlelit streets and drafty halls, the nations were the true heartbeat of student life. Taverns, pranks, and rowdiness. Student life beyond the classroom. While lectures, disputations, and studies filled the daylight hours, the true flavor of student life often emerged after dark. This was when the streets, taverns, and alleys of medieval cities came alive with laughter, chaos, and occasional mischief. Students were scholars, yes, but they were also pranksters, revelers, and sometimes troublemakers. The tavern, heart of social life. Taverns were the beating heart of student social life. Long benches, wooden tables, and roaring fires created the perfect environment for camaraderie, gossip, and storytelling. Cheap ale and coarse bread fueled hours of conversation, debate, and, occasionally, arguments. For a student, a tavern was more than a place to eat and drink. It was a classroom of a different sort. Here, one learned negotiation, storytelling, and the delicate art of persuasion, not in Latin texts, but in the messy, unpredictable world of human interaction. Pranks. A national pastime. Pranks were a staple of student life, fueled by boredom, creativity, and a dash of rebellion. Some were small and harmless, moving a roommate's shoes, swapping ink with soot, or tying a sleeping student's legs together. Others were elaborate, like hoisting a giant pumpkin onto the roof of a rival nation's dormitory, or releasing frogs in the lecture hall. Pranks were rarely just for fun. They were a form of competition, a way to assert cleverness, and sometimes even a subtle rebellion against authority. A well-executed prank brought glory to the perpetrator and sometimes disaster, if the master or town officials caught wind of it. Rowdiness and riots. Sometimes student energy escalated into full-blown rowdiness. Street fights, mock battles between nations, and tavern brawls were not uncommon. Spoons became weapons, benches turned into barricades, and ale flowed freely. University authorities often struggled to maintain order. Curfews and fines existed, but enforcement was tricky when hundreds of young men, far from home, banded together. Some townsfolk despised students for their antics, while others secretly admired their audacity. Songs and storytelling. Not all rowdiness was chaotic. Students loved music and storytelling, and taverns provided the perfect stage. Songs ranged from sacred hymns to Bodhi ballads. Stories of heroes, saints, and even local gossip filled the air, sometimes spilling over into impromptu performances on benches and tables. Singing was not just entertainment. It was a way to memorize texts, bond with fellow students, and lighten the stress of study. Imagine a group of tired, cold students, cloaks wrapped tight, singing Latin verses while the tavern fire crackles, learning, laughing, and living all at once. Love and romance. Student life beyond the classroom sometimes involved romance, though discretion was required. Relationships with local women could be charming, complicated, or scandalous. Courting might involve poetry, songs, or small gifts, and often led to secret meetings in gardens or quiet streets. However, these romances were rarely safe. Students were often under the watchful eye of their nations, masters, or strict moral codes enforced by the church. Love was thrilling but risky, adding yet another layer of excitement to city life. Hunger, ale, and humor. Let's not forget food or the lack of it. Students were often hungry, relying on bread, cheese, and scraps. Tavern ale was both sustenance and indulgence, filling the stomach when food was scarce. Hunger, discomfort, and boredom sometimes fueled humor. Students wrote jokes in margins, pulled pranks, or made fun of lecturers' quirks. Laughter was a survival tactic, a way to endure the harsh realities of medieval student life. Allies in mischief. Mischief wasn't a solo endeavor. Students relied on their nations, roommates, and friends to pull off elaborate tricks. Planning, timing, and secrecy were essential. One poorly timed prank could backfire spectacularly, turning the pranksters into the prankies. The camaraderie developed through these adventures was real. Shared laughter, whispered schemes, and narrow escapes created bonds stronger than any lecture could offer. For many students, these moments were the most memorable of their university life. Balancing work and play. Despite all the fun, students had to balance mischief with studies. Exams, disputations, and lectures were relentless. Skipping class could result in punishment, and a failed disputation could damage reputation. So, the best students learned to juggle learning and leisure. They studied diligently, copied texts carefully, but also made time for late-night laughter, pranks, and storytelling. It was a delicate balance, one that required energy, cunning, and a sense of humor. A night in the life picture. Our scholar in the evening. Lectures are over, notes copied, and quill tucked away. He meets friends from his nation and heads to the tavern. Ale warms their hands, bread fills their stomachs, and laughter fills the air. A prank is hatched. A rival nation's banner will be borrowed for a few hours. Singing ensues, stories are shared, and a small scuffle breaks out over a spilled drink. By midnight, the group staggers home, tired but exhilarated, cloaks damp, faces smudged with candle soot and laughter. Back in his dorm, our scholar scratches a final note, a doodle of the night's antics, before finally collapsing onto straw bedding. Closing thought. Student life beyond the classroom was messy, noisy, and unpredictable. It was about food, drink, pranks, friendship, and sometimes chaos. Yet it was also vital to the medieval university experience. These moments of levity and rebellion shaped students' character, tested their wit, and strengthened bonds that could last a lifetime. In the candlelit streets and smoky taverns, students learned not just from books, but from life itself, the joys, the mischief, and the enduring camaraderie that defined their university years. Famous universities in focus. Paris, Bologna, and Oxford next. You said, yes, ChatGPT said, perfect. Here's Chapter 13, Famous Universities in Focus. Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, written in the same relaxed, storytelling, bedtime style with light humor. Word count 1,000 to 1,100 words. Chapter 13, Famous Universities in Focus. Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. By now, our young scholar has survived lectures, dormitories, pranks, and long nights by candlelight. But where exactly was all this learning happening? The medieval universities of Europe were not uniform. Each had its own character, specialties, and traditions. Today, we'll take a leisurely stroll through the streets and halls of three famous centers of learning: Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. Paris, the city of theology. Paris in the 12th and 13th centuries was a bustling city of churches, markets, and scholars. Its university quickly became Europe's center of theology and philosophy. The famous Sorbonne, founded in the early 13th century, attracted students eager to debate God, Scripture, and the mysteries of the soul. The lecture halls were often cold and dim, illuminated by candles flickering in the stone recesses. Masters in long black robes read from Latin manuscripts, and students scribbled notes feverishly. Imagine a sea of quills scratching on parchment, voices murmuring in Latin, and the distant tolling of church bells. Parisian students were serious about learning, but also serious about reputation. Disputations could last hours, and a clever student could earn fame and, sometimes infamy, by arguing a point with brilliance or audacity. But even in this hallowed city, the smell of tallow candles, ink, and smoke from hearths reminded everyone that study was hard work, often tinged with discomfort. Bologna, the empire of law heading south to Italy. Bologna was the birthplace of legal studies. The city's university had no grand cathedral or Sorbonne. It thrived instead on law, contracts, and the study of Roman codes. Students from all over Europe flocked to Bologna to master jurisprudence, and professors were highly respected authorities. Unlike Paris, where theology reigned supreme, Bologna's streets buzzed with debates over statutes, contracts, and legal principles. Students pored over dusty scrolls, learning to interpret laws that governed kingdoms and courts. A mistaken lecture could mean embarrassment, but a clever legal argument could open doors to royal service. Bologna was known for its lively student life as well. Nations formed quickly, alliances were made, and, as always, mischief was plentiful. The streets were noisy with scholars carrying scrolls and arguing loudly about a point of law or a tavern prank gone wrong. Here, the pursuit of legal knowledge was both rigorous and chaotic. Oxford, the rising star of England, crossing the Channel to England, Oxford was emerging as a major university in the 12th century. It combined elements of both Paris and Bologna, theology, philosophy, and some law, though the English university would eventually develop its own unique traditions. Oxford's colleges were small and closely knit. Students often lodged within college walls, sharing meals, lessons, and living spaces. The town-and-gown rivalry was already a feature, as students, mostly young men, sometimes clashed with townsfolk over noise, rents, or petty arguments. Masters at Oxford taught in halls or chapels, and students debated with the same fervor seen in Paris, but Oxford also prided itself on its intellectual independence. Students were encouraged to question authorities, leading to lively disputations and the occasional spirited rebellion. Daily life across the universities, despite differences in focus and culture, student life had common threads. Bells marked the hours for lectures and prayers. Candles flickered as quills scratched across parchment late into the night. Students argued fiercely in disputations, sometimes winning fame, sometimes embarrassment. Food was humble everywhere: bread, cheese, pottage, and ale, but conversations, laughter, and occasional songs made meals lively. Dormitories were cramped, and pranks were universal. Even the most prestigious universities had their share of chaos. Imagine a typical day. The master lectures, students copy notes, one nation sneaks a prank, another debates a theological point. Later, students gather in taverns, share a simple meal, and joke about professors' quirks. Despite centuries of difference, the rhythm of study, social life, and mischief felt surprisingly similar across these cities. Famous figures and scholars, each university produced great minds. Paris gave us theologians like Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard, whose debates shaped centuries of philosophy. Bologna trained lawyers whose knowledge of Roman law influenced European courts for generations. Oxford nurtured thinkers like Robert Grosseteste and later, John Wycliffe, who challenged church doctrines and shaped the intellectual climate of England. Our young scholar might not yet be famous, but he walked in the footsteps of these figures, copying texts, debating points, and absorbing lessons that would ripple through history. Even small achievements, finishing a disputation, finishing a parchment scroll, mastering a tricky Latin passage, felt monumental in the candlelit halls. Atmosphere and charm. Walking through these cities today, one can still sense the medieval student life. The narrow streets, the echoes of bell towers, the quiet courtyards where students once debated, they all whisper of past lives. The charm wasn't just in learning, it was in the rhythm of daily life. Bells ringing, candles flickering, quills scratching, laughter spilling from taverns. Knowledge was serious, yes, but so were camaraderie, mischief, and the simple joys of being a student far from home. Closing thought: Paris, Bologna, and Oxford weren't just buildings or institutions, they were living, breathing worlds of their own. Each had its specialties, traditions, and quirks, yet all shared the same heartbeat, the pursuit of knowledge. Our scholar, moving from lecture hall to dormitory to tavern, was part of something timeless. He felt the weight of parchment, the scratch of quills, the warmth of friendship, and the thrill of discovery. And in these famous universities, students didn't just learn, they lived, argued, laughed, and sometimes misbehaved, leaving a legacy that continues to shape learning today. Exams, disputations, and the long road to graduation. If dormitories, taverns, and pranks were the heartbeat of student life, then exams and disputations were its stern, relentless pulse. While late-night laughter and ink-stained fingers made medieval university life vivid, the path to a degree was filled with challenges that tested wit, memory, and nerves. The nature of medieval exams: unlike today, exams were not written in neat multiple-choice forms or typed on a screen. Most were oral. A student might stand before a master for hours, reciting texts, explaining complex ideas, or defending an argument. One misstep could result in humiliation or worse, failure. Students prepared meticulously. Quills scratched on parchment late into the night as they memorized Latin texts, theological arguments, or legal codes. A master might test them on trivium subjects like grammar, rhetoric, and logic, or on the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The oral exam was as much a performance as it was a test. Students had to speak clearly, argue convincingly, and maintain composure under pressure. Imagine standing in a drafty hall, cold stone underfoot, candle smoke curling, while a stern master asks questions faster than your brain can process. Disputations. The art of debate exams were formal, but disputations were the dramatic, public version of testing knowledge. A disputation might draw dozens of students and even curious townsfolk. Here, one student posed a question, and another defended a position, sometimes on theology, sometimes on law, sometimes on a question so abstract it makes modern heads spin. These debates were highly structured. The challenger presented a thesis, the respondent defended, and masters judged the argument. Points of logic, scripture, and precedent were wielded like swords, and clever students often used humor or wit to win favor. A successful disputation could bring reputation, influence, and even future patronage. A failure, public embarrassment, and whispered gossip in the hallways. For a medieval student, every debate was both an intellectual test and a social spectacle. The role of memory memorization was everything. Texts were copied by hand, and students often carried entire arguments in their minds. There were no cheat sheets, no printed textbooks for quick reference. Everything depended on hours of study, careful repetition, and sometimes, frantic candlelit scribbling the night before an exam. Some students developed mnemonic tricks, like songs or quirky rhymes, to remember theological points or legal statutes. One can imagine students humming obscure Latin phrases while sneaking down streets for a midnight snack or a last-minute consultation with a friend from their nation. Masters as judges during exams and disputations. Masters were not gentle. They could be intimidating, sharp-tongued, and unyielding. A mispronounced word or shaky argument might earn a pointed correction or a sarcastic remark that would echo through the hall. Yet this harshness was part of the education. Masters believed that true understanding was tested under pressure. The fear, tension, and occasional embarrassment pushed students to refine their reasoning, deepen their memory, and sharpen their wit. The ritual of graduation. After years of study, students who survived lectures, pranks, sleepless nights, and fiery debates could finally approach graduation. But even this was a formal, ritualistic affair. Students presented themselves before masters, recited key texts, and defended their final disputations. Graduation wasn't a casual celebration. It was a public acknowledgement of skill and perseverance. The ceremony often included Latin proclamations, the wearing of robes, and the presence of patrons or city officials. It was the medieval equivalent of a moment frozen in time, a student transformed into a recognized scholar, ready to contribute knowledge to the world. Struggles along the way. The road to graduation was long and grueling. Students faced illness, hunger, and financial stress. Parchment and ink were expensive, lodging could be uncomfortable, and masters demanded discipline and respect. One mistake in a disputation or a poorly argued thesis could set a student back months or years. And yet, these struggles were part of the adventure. Every challenge, every sleepless night, and every public debate built character. Students learned not only knowledge, but endurance, resilience, and the art of navigating a complex social and academic world. Exams as social events. Interestingly, exams and disputations were also social gatherings. Townsfolk might watch debates, fellow students might cheer for clever arguments, and families could occasionally witness the spectacle. A successful student earned not only academic recognition but social admiration. This blend of scholarship, performance, and social interaction made the medieval exam something more than a test. It was a theater of learning, a community event, and a rite of passage all at once. A day in exam life. Picture our scholar, nervous yet determined, standing in a drafty hall. The master eyes him over spectacles, candlelight flickering across parchment and quills. Questions come fast. He answers, hesitates, corrects himself. Fellow students watch with anticipation, some whispering encouragement, others stifling smirks. Hours pass, sweat, cold, and candle smoke mingle. Finally, the master nods, a slight smile crossing his face. The student breathes deeply, relieved, proud, and exhausted. Tonight, he might sleep by candlelight, dreaming of Aristotle, law codes, and disputations yet to come. Closing thought. Exams, disputations, and graduation were more than academic milestones. They were rites of passage. They tested memory, reasoning, and character. They demanded endurance, patience, and courage. Through these challenges, students learned not only subjects, but life skills, how to argue persuasively, think critically, and endure discomfort with grace. The flicker of candlelight, the scratch of quills, and the tension of public debate became woven into the very fabric of medieval scholarship. For our scholar, the long road to graduation was filled with struggle, laughter, and learning, a journey that shaped not only his mind, but his character, and connected him to centuries of European intellectual history. Religious life and moral codes in the university for medieval students. Education wasn't just about logic, law, or literature. Religion was woven into every aspect of daily life. Universities were often connected to cathedrals or monasteries, and the moral and spiritual development of students was considered just as important as academic achievement. Daily prayers and church attendance. Students were expected to attend Mass and prayers multiple times a day. Morning, noon, and evening bells marked the rhythm of religious life. Some lectures were scheduled around church services, and missing a service could be considered a serious offense. Imagine our scholar, waking in a cramped, straw-filled dormitory, shivering under a thin blanket. The church bells toll, and he hurriedly dresses in his simple cloak and cap, hoping the master won't notice his bedhead as he files into the chilly stone chapel. Prayers were often in Latin, and students recited them with varying degrees of devotion. Some were sincere, others whispered the words quickly while planning a prank or calculating tomorrow's expenses. Still, even this ritual instilled a sense of order, rhythm, and connection to a wider spiritual community. Confession and spiritual guidance. Confession was an essential part of student life. Moral lapses, lying, cheating, or mischief required penance. Students could confess to a priest or sometimes to a master acting in a moral advisory role. Penance could be simple, like extra prayers or fasting, or more creative. Imagine a student who swapped ink with soot being told to recite Latin passages in the chapel, kneeling before the congregation. It wasn't just punishment, it was also a public reminder of accountability. Spiritual guidance helped students navigate the tricky balance between study, play, and moral duty. Masters and priests offered advice, warned against excesses, and encouraged ethical behavior. For young scholars far from home, this guidance was often comforting, like a moral compass amidst the chaos of city life. Moral codes and discipline. Universities had strict rules. Sometimes codified in written statutes, students were expected to behave according to a moral code, which included honesty, respect for masters, restraint in taverns, and proper conduct with women. Breaking these rules could result in fines, public reprimand, or even suspension. Yet, enforcement was uneven. Clever students found ways to bend rules, especially when mischief involved their own nations or friends. Still, the presence of a moral framework created boundaries. Students learned that freedom came with responsibility, a lesson as valuable as any Latin grammar or Roman law statute. Fasting and feasts. Religious observances influenced even food. Certain days required fasting, meaning no meat, sometimes no food at all during daylight hours. Taverns adapted, offering fish or simple vegetarian meals to students observing these rules. Feast days, on the other hand, were joyful and boisterous. Students celebrated with special meals, songs, and sometimes lighthearted pranks. Religious life wasn't all strict. It offered rhythm, ritual, and moments of shared joy. Religious debate. The connection between study and religion was deep. Many lectures and disputations revolved around theological questions, the nature of God, the soul, and morality. Students learned to argue with logic and respect, but also to confront complex ethical dilemmas. This training prepared them for careers in the church, law, or academia. Even if a student didn't intend to become a theologian, debating morality sharpened reasoning skills and taught the importance of evidence, persuasion, and careful thought. Balancing fun and faith. Despite strict moral codes, students were still mischievous, social, and lively. Balancing study, religion, and fun was a delicate art. Taverns, pranks, and late-night debates coexisted with prayers, mass, and penance. Our scholar might sneak back from a tavern in time for evening prayers, whispering a Latin hymn under his breath while swearing never to swap ink again until the next mischievous idea arrived. This tension between discipline and play was part of the charm of medieval student life. The role of masters. Masters were more than teachers. They were moral guides. They reminded students of their duties, intervened in disputes, and sometimes acted as confessors or advisors. Respecting a master meant respecting both knowledge and moral authority. Yet masters could also be humorous or lenient, allowing small mistakes to pass as long as students learned from them. In this way, the university combined strict expectations with a recognition of human fallibility. A day in religious life. Picture a typical day. The scholar wakes early, dresses quickly, and hurries to chapel for morning prayers. Lectures follow, then a shared meal of bread and cheese. In the afternoon, he debates a moral question in the hall, arguing carefully under the watchful eye of a master. Evening brings a tavern visit or quiet discussion with friends, perhaps planning a prank but always returning in time for night prayers. Candles flicker, quills scratch, and the city hums with bells. Faith and study, discipline and mischief, coexist in the life of the medieval student. Closing thought. Religious life and moral codes were not just rules, they were part of the rhythm, structure, and soul of medieval universities. They guided students, offered comfort, and instilled lessons that went beyond the classroom. Our scholar, juggling prayers, disputations, and pranks, learned that wisdom wasn't just knowledge, but also ethics, community, and responsibility. Amid candlelight and stone walls, faith and learning intertwined, shaping a generation of thinkers who balanced curiosity with conscience. The daily life of a scholar, routines, study habits, and leisure life in a medieval university wasn't all grand debates, mischief, and tavern adventures. There was a rhythm, a routine that governed each day, guiding students from candlelit mornings to late-night copying of texts. The life of a scholar was a delicate balance of study, discipline, friendship, and occasional fun. Morning, bells, and beginnings. A typical day began early. Bells from nearby churches or the university itself rang through narrow streets, calling students from their cramped dormitories. Straw mattresses and thin blankets did little to ease the chill, but scholars had little choice. Learning waited for no one. Our young student would rise, pull on a simple cloak, and grab a quill and parchment. Breakfast was modest: bread, cheese, maybe a sip of ale for warmth. Some students might pray first, others hurriedly scribble last-minute notes for the morning lecture. The streets themselves were alive, vendors calling their wares, carriages clattering over cobblestones, and fellow students rushing past, quills tucked under arms and books clutched to chests. In these small moments, the city and the university intertwined, shaping the rhythm of daily life. Lectures and study morning lectures were often the most formal part of the day. The master read aloud from a manuscript, pausing to explain, comment, or answer questions. Students copied every word carefully, quills scratching across parchment in a syncopated symphony of concentration. Subjects varied. The trivium grammar, rhetoric, and logics formed a foundation, while the quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy added layers of complexity. Advanced students might study law, theology, or medicine, engaging in rigorous intellectual exploration. Though lectures were serious, students often found ways to stay alert, whispering notes to each other, drawing marginal doodles, or occasionally stifling a yawn with a handkerchief. The life of a scholar was hard, but it was alive with thought, debate, and curiosity. Meals and breaks midday brought a short reprieve. Meals were simple but social, eaten with friends from the same nation or dormitory. Bread, pottage, cheese, and sometimes fish formed the staples, accompanied by ale or weak wine. Mealtimes weren't just about nourishment, they were moments of connection. Students shared news, discussed lectures, and plotted light-hearted pranks. Some argued over trivial points of grammar or law, while others reminisced about past disputes or clever tricks. In this small window of respite, the social life of the university thrived. Afternoon, debates and disputation. The afternoons were often devoted to debates or smaller group discussions. Disputations allowed students to defend theses, question peers, and demonstrate their reasoning. These sessions were as much performance as pedagogy, requiring quick thinking, eloquence, and sometimes courage. A clever student might win favor with a master, earn admiration from peers, or even secure a recommendation for future study or patronage. But mistakes were visible, and embarrassment could linger, whispered about in dormitories or taverns long after the debate ended. Study habits in the late afternoon following lectures or debates. Many students returned to their dormitories to continue private study. Copying manuscripts, annotating texts, or translating passages occupied long hours. Parchment was expensive, so every word counted, and mistakes were costly. Lighting was dim, relying on tallow candles that smoked and flickered. The air often smelled of ink, burnt wax, and straw from bedding. Yet, in this quiet, students built the foundation of their knowledge, carefully crafting notes that might later be referenced by scholars for generations. Evening, leisure, and social life. Evening brought a chance for relaxation. Some students gathered in taverns to share a modest meal, debate informally, or sing songs. Others might stroll the city streets, discuss ideas, or plan pranks. Friendships deepened during these hours. Shared laughter, advice, and small adventures strengthened bonds. Students learned to balance diligence with enjoyment, discovering that life was richer when study and leisure complemented each other. Night, candlelight and reflection. Nighttime was often reserved for quiet work. Students copied notes by candlelight, reviewed lessons, or prepared for the next day's disputation. The scratching of quills, the occasional cough, and the flicker of candle flames created a meditative atmosphere. Some students, exhausted, might nap briefly before returning to study. Sleep was precious but often interrupted by the demands of learning or the occasional prank. Even in these quiet hours, the pulse of the university knowledge, curiosity, and camaraderie remained steady, balancing work and fun. Medieval scholars were not machines. They laughed, argued, joked, and occasionally broke rules, yet their daily routines instilled discipline and resilience. The cycle of lectures, meals, debates, study, and leisure taught time management, perseverance, and the value of small joys. Our young scholar might stumble out of the tavern, cloak damp, and hair messy, only to sit later under candlelight, pen in hand, determined to master the next Latin passage. Life was a balance dance between obligation and freedom, seriousness and mischief. A typical day in summary? Imagine a full day, rising with church bells, a simple breakfast, lectures, and copying notes. Debates in the afternoon, a hearty or humble meal with friends, a brief walk or tavern visit, and finally, quiet study by candlelight. Add pranks, laughter, and whispered gossip, and you have a rich tapestry of student life. The routine, though structured, allowed room for creativity, play, and growth. It was within this rhythm that students learned, lived, and formed bonds that often lasted a lifetime. Closing thought. The daily life of a medieval scholar combined discipline and delight, study and mischief, friendship and solitary reflection. In the flickering candlelight of drafty halls, students discovered not only knowledge but resilience, community, and the joy of curiosity. For a young scholar, each day was both challenge and adventure, shaping a life that balanced learning, laughter, and the timeless pursuit of wisdom. Discipline, rules, and the consequences of misbehavior. Medieval universities were lively places full of debate, mischief, and adventure, but they weren't lawless playgrounds. Rules existed, and discipline was taken seriously. Students were expected to follow moral codes, respect masters, and maintain a semblance of order, or face consequences that could range from a scolding to suspension. The importance of rules. Rules were designed to maintain order in a city overflowing with young scholars. Students came from distant lands, speaking different dialects and bringing their own customs. Without structure, chaos would reign. Some rules were simple: attend lectures, arrive on time, dress appropriately, and respect masters. Others were more about morality: avoid excessive drinking, uphold honesty, and respect women and townsfolk. While rules might seem strict by today's standards, they created a framework that allowed thousands of students to live and study in relatively close quarters. Masters and authorities. Discipline was enforced by masters, rectors, and sometimes local officials. Masters acted as teachers, judges, and moral guides. If a student misbehaved, arguing disrespectfully, skipping lectures, or pranking the wrong person, the master could reprimand, punish, or assign penance. For example, a student who misquoted Aristotle might have to publicly defend his point again, or write extra essays. One who caused a tavern brawl could face fines or temporary suspension. Punishments were often designed to teach a lesson, not just to embarrass. Common offenses. Students, despite the rules, often tested limits. Common offenses included skipping lectures. Sometimes students were lured away by taverns, friends, or just fatigue. Tavern mischief, drinking too much ale, starting fights, or disturbing townsfolk. Pranks, harmless fun could sometimes escalate into serious trouble, like releasing animals in a dormitory. Dishonesty, cheating during disputations or exams was frowned upon and punished. Breaking moral codes, disrespecting clergy, women, or masters could result in both academic and religious consequences. Yet clever students often found loopholes or relied on their nations to shield them. Mischief was part of life, but it came with risk, consequences, and penance. Punishments varied in severity. Minor offenses might involve extra prayers, writing essays, or public apologies. More serious breaches could lead to fines, suspension, or even expulsion. Some universities had formal systems. For example, a student causing a riot could be summoned before a council of masters. They might order him to kneel, recite a text, or perform a public act of penance. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was education, teaching students responsibility and accountability. Curfews and supervision. Curfews were common, especially for younger students. Dormitories were locked at night, and leaving without permission could bring consequences. Masters or senior students often patrolled, ensuring safety and adherence to rules. These curfews might seem strict, but they protected students in unfamiliar, sometimes dangerous cities. Being far from home, students needed guidance as much as freedom. Rules created a balance between liberty and responsibility. Moral lessons from discipline. Discipline wasn't only about punishment. It taught critical life skills, self-control, learning to balance, study, leisure, and moral obligations. Respect, understanding the authority of masters, peers, and community. Responsibility, facing consequences for actions, both small and large. Problem solving, navigating social complexities, disputes, and rules with wit. Our scholar, while grumbling over a finer penance, would also learn resilience, strategic thinking, and the importance of foresight. These lessons lasted far beyond the walls of the university. Humor in discipline. Discipline wasn't always grim. Sometimes punishments had a humorous side. Students might be sent to the chapel wearing a comical cloak, kneeling while reciting Latin passages incorrectly, or performing exaggerated gestures for the amusement of peers. Even serious consequences were softened by camaraderie. Fellow students often whispered encouragement, offered advice, or shared stories of others' misadventures. The university blended rigor with levity, teaching lessons while keeping spirits alive. The role of nations in discipline. Nations, the student groups we explored earlier, often influenced discipline. A student in trouble might be defended by his nation, creating negotiations with masters or officials. This collective responsibility strengthened bonds, but also reminded students that their actions affected more than themselves. Discipline, therefore, was both individual and communal. It was a constant reminder that scholarship came with duties, moral expectations, and the need to navigate society wisely. A day in the life of consequences. Imagine a scholar returning late from a tavern, quill tucked under his arm, face flushed with laughter. A master notices, frowns, and summons him. The student kneels, recites a Latin passage, and mutters apologies while friends try to hide their amusement. By morning, he is back in lecture, notes in hand, perhaps a little wiser, certainly more cautious, but still ready for the next adventure, mischief, or prank. Life at a medieval university was full of lessons, both academic and moral. Closing thought, discipline, and rules were essential to the rhythm of university life. They maintained order, taught responsibility, and shaped character. Students learned that freedom was balanced with consequence, curiosity with caution, and adventure with accountability. For our scholar, every reprimand, penance, or public correction was part of the education. Amid candlelight, quills, and laughter, he discovered that knowledge alone wasn't enough. Wisdom also required judgment, ethics, and the courage to face the results of one's actions. Legacy of the medieval universities, foundations for modern education. As our journey through candlelit halls, bustling taverns, and drafty dormitories comes to a close, it's time to reflect on the lasting legacy of the medieval universities of Europe. These institutions, born from curiosity, ambition, and the desire for knowledge, shaped not just the lives of young scholars, but the entire course of education in the centuries to follow. The birth of a new kind of learning in the 11th and 12th centuries. The idea of a university was revolutionary. Learning moved beyond monasteries and cathedrals, becoming organized, communal, and more systematic. Students from all over Europe gathered to study, debate, and copy manuscripts by candlelight. These early universities formalized the trivium and quadrivium, set standards for examinations and disputations, and created frameworks for degrees. The notion of structured study, mentorship by masters, and communal academic life laid the foundation for the modern university. Enduring traditions, some medieval traditions, survive even today. Graduation robes, Latin mottos, and ceremonial degrees trace their roots to these early institutions. Disputation, though rarely public anymore, still influences academic debates, thesis defenses, and scholarly discussions. Even student camaraderie, the joking, late-night study sessions, and shared pranks as echoes in modern campus life. While dormitories are now more comfortable and lectures less perilous, the spirit of curiosity, collaboration, and spirited debate remains remarkably similar. Influence on modern education. Medieval universities shaped not just European education but the very idea of a scholarly community. They standardized curriculum. Subjects were organized, sequenced, and taught. Created degrees. Bachelor, master, and doctor titles originated here. Promoted mobility. Students traveled from city to city, learning from different masters, much like modern exchange programs. Encouraged inquiry, disputation, and debate. Fostered critical thinking and argumentation skills. Our scholar who once argued theology in candlelit halls, copied texts in the dead of night, or navigated tavern mischief, was part of a movement that transformed learning from a private cloistered pursuit into a structured social and enduring enterprise. Social and cultural impact. Universities also influenced society at large. They produced theologians, lawyers, doctors, and thinkers who shaped European culture, law, and religion. Ideas developed in Paris, Bologna, or Oxford spread far beyond city walls, influencing courts, kingdoms, and churches. Moreover, universities fostered a sense of identity and community. Nations of students, guild-like structures, and shared traditions created networks of influence and friendship that lasted lifetimes. This social cohesion helped preserve knowledge, propagate culture, and advance learning across generations. Contrast. Student hardships versus prestige. It's important to remember that life as a medieval student was far from luxurious. Dormitories were cramped, food was meager, and exams could be terrifying. Candlelight scratched notes could mean long hours of fatigue and strain. Yet alongside these hardships existed extraordinary prestige. Masters wielded influence, cities valued scholars, and a degree could open doors to church positions, legal careers, or service to kings. The contrast between the ordinary struggles of students and the honor of scholarship created a unique tension, one that fueled determination, resilience, and creativity. Inspiration for future generations. The medieval university model inspired later educational systems. Renaissance universities, the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, and modern higher education all owe a debt to these early institutions. Concepts like academic freedom, structured learning, and peer review echo the traditions of candlelit halls and oral discussion. For every young scholar struggling with a Latin passage or a tricky philosophical argument, there's a thread connecting them to centuries of learners who came before, curious, determined, and sometimes mischievous. A scholar's perspective. Imagine our scholar, now older, reflecting on his journey. He remembers the early days arriving in a strange city, joining a nation, enduring drafty dorms, surviving oral exams, and laughing through mischief with friends. He recalls masters who challenged him, peers who inspired him, and nights spent by candlelight, quill in hand. All of this contributed to a lasting knowledge, a disciplined mind, and an understanding of human nature. He might smile at the memory of pranks, laugh at debates gone awry, and feel pride in the skills and wisdom he gained. The eternal student, the medieval university experience, reminds us that learning is timeless. Even centuries later, the quest for knowledge, the bonds of friendship, the thrill of debate, and the satisfaction of understanding remain universal. Students may change, tools may change, but the essence of curiosity, persistence, and communal growth endures. The eternal student is not just a figure of history, it's anyone who seeks to learn, question, and grow through books, conversations, or reflection. And in this sense, the candlelit halls of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford still live, quietly inspiring scholars today. Closing thought. As we end our journey, imagine the slow scratching of quills in a medieval hall, murmurs of debate fading into silence, and generations of students quietly building the foundation of modern learning. Knowledge, discipline, and curiosity continue to ripple across time, connecting the past to the present. Medieval universities were more than institutions. They were communities, adventures, and crucibles of intellect. Their legacy lives on, reminding us that the pursuit of learning is eternal, messy, joyful, and profoundly human. And so, our journey through the flickering candlelight, echoing lecture halls, and bustling streets of medieval Europe comes to a peaceful close. We've walked alongside students, heard the scratch of quills, felt the warmth of camaraderie, and glimpsed the beginnings of the universities that shaped the world of learning we know today. As you drift into your own quiet thoughts, remember the eternal student, curious, persistent, and full of wonder, whose journey reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is timeless, gentle, and endlessly inspiring. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Sleeping Historian, and tap the bell to join us on many more journeys through history's quiet corners. Sleep well, dream of candlelit halls and parchment scrolls, and we'll meet again for another calm voyage through the past.